Thanks. Okay, thanks, Alex, for the kind words, and thanks, Simon, for the introduction, for organising this. It's great to be here. So yeah, my name is Connor. I work at Bruegel. I'm a research analyst, and here I'm going to mainly just, as background, be drawing on research that. So there was a joint report written by Bruegel and CEPR report. So it's 5 chapters in there if you're interested in this. Some of it's about modelling decoupling. Some of it's about doing detailed empirical work. There's a mixture of US and European researchers. So yeah, but if any of this I'm interested, would recommend having a look. So in my very limited time, I'm going to try to just focus on 3 things, give an overview of the kind of the EU economic security strategy, like the documents, the relatively scarce legislative proposals that are in there. Discuss some of the issues around coherence and governance in the context of this meeting, and then finally just a few comments on how it could possibly be improved. So next slide, please. Yes. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, as you may be aware, so in June 2023, the EU took its first kind of official foray into the area of economic security with the launch of its communication of the European economic security strategy. As we will talk about, a lot of the policies that are actually involved in this strategy predate this sometimes by quite a while. 1 or 2 of them are more new, but generally this is the strategy that puts existing policies together in a kind of coherent way. Unlike researchers, and I think possibly a lot of people here have been working on this, the Commission kind of sidestepped the whole debate on what is economic security. Different people have used it to use completely different things. The Commission said they basically highlighted 4 risks while noting this is, these evolve and this is not exhaustive. They talk about basically supply chain resilience, critical infrastructure, technology security and leakage, and economic coercion. And the thing where they come to this list is they talk about geoeconomic interlinkages, geopolitical developments, and technological advancements led to risks to the EU's economy. So, for example, we wouldn't necessarily consider critical infrastructure, so physical and cyber security of critical infrastructure, to be economic security. We would consider that to be more physical and national security. But anyway, it's in the strategy. Their response, they kind of grouped the policy responses in 3 areas. So they talk about promoting European industry, protecting European industry, and partnering with third countries. I've put in bold there as well 2 things that kind of get overlooked in the conversation. They also note that the principles of proportionality and precision should guide implementation. And we think that's very good. Restraint is important here, as we go on to talk about. In some of these cases, the cure can maybe be worse than the disease, so building in restraint early on is quite important. And then, yeah, finally, so as kind of started off with, some of these policies that they include, so this document essentially lists many, many different policies that purportedly fall under the area of economic security. Some of them definitely do. So the Anti-coercion Instrument, introduced in the last few years, IMERS, that's the Internal Market Emergency and Resilience Act. That's about basically improving the functioning of the single market in times of crises. So be that pandemic, be that kind of economic coercion. So that's quite clearly about economic security. Others, it's a bit more of a reach. So they talk about cohesion policy, next gen EU, capital markets union, EU standardization strategy. While clearly important maybe in terms of building the EU's economy, and without which any conversation on economic security is kind of pointless. We don't think the primary motivation of these policies is not economic security, so we don't think they should be really treated as economic security policies. Next slide, please. And very briefly, 2 other this kind of rounds out the kind of legislative releases. So in October of 2023, there was a recommendation on critical technology areas. This basically came up with 10 technological areas, and 4 in particular that there's a real risk around. So they come up with this from the enabling and transformative nature of these technologies, the potential for dual use with military capabilities, and human rights potential abuses. So they come up with basically 10 areas that we really need to look into around technological security. And then finally, in January 2024, there are 5 new initiatives. Only one of them has anything to do with actually legislative, well, 2 have to do with legislative proposals. There's a proposal for updating the FDI screening regulation, which was introduced in 2019. And it's basically about closing a few loopholes. But to be honest, none of these are anything to really raise your eyebrow about. They're about closing gaps, nothing hugely significant. So next slide, please. So that's kind of the overview of what the EU's legislative agenda around economic security has looked like. So how do we now assess it in context, especially policy coherence with other areas? First thing to note is that not only do you have, your traditional national versus EU competencies divide, some things fall at national level. So some industrial policy stuff, some education and skills stuff, for example, others at the EU level, be that state aid approval, be that trade policy. We also have, the real potential for a turf war at EU level. So between different DGs, I've listed a few there. There's different areas that, could all fall under the idea of economic security. So we basically think governance is really important here. This is particularly important, when we see this whole talk about a new defense commissioner and the idea, we think there's a risk that, if this isn't properly, you could basically very much see as we move towards the implementation phase of a lot of these things, you could see very different outcomes if this falls under the remit of DG Grow or if it falls under the remit of DG Trade or DG Comp. So we think governance is really important here. There's also, as I think I won't really talk about it now, so we'll touch on it again, there's a lot of overlap with other policy areas, so green transition, development, competitiveness. And finally, the last kind of, governance kind of point to make is around just the fact that, again, at national level, there's a lot of different divergent views on what constitutes a risk, on geopolitical outlooks. So for some of these measures, so for example, the Anti-coercion Instrument, you need qualified majority vote at the council. And as we've seen already, there's real difficulty sometimes arriving at consensus. So we shouldn't overlook the actual challenges around implementation. Next slide, please. My last one. So this is kind of where we come to our evaluation of what we think of the European economic security strategy. Overall, we think the Commission has been good on this. We think they've moved early. We think in various different areas, they've kind of been ahead of different comparable actors. So as you said, a lot of the policies, be that the EU Chips Act, be that the FDI screening, be that all this, they actually predated this kind of focus on economic security. So, there's a lot that's been done. But as we've looked then, the policy proposals that have actually come out of the economic security strategy, they've been about technology security and preventing leakage more so. We think there's a lot more that can be done more around the supply chain resilience and diversification. Okay, so first point there is classic researcher point, but data availability and analysis. So Isabelle Mejean and Pierre Rousseau and the CPRP stated a whole basically deep dive to try and develop, try to understand trade dependencies. And the point they make, even something on like production data in the EU, Prodcom is terrible. Like half the values are just missing or they're blank. And so when we try to know, okay, could we replace our import dependency with domestic production? We just don't know. Data on intra-EU trade linkages also not there. So firms that maybe import from, a Belgian firm that imports from France might not be aware that that French firm relies on China for its imports. So there's just, the first step is mapping the ecosystem here. Secondly, and this actually draws on work that Merrick's have done, and you were involved in as well, looking at, often we talk about economic security, we talk about imports. That's because, when we looked at COVID, there was import shocks. When we looked at Russia, there was import shocks around energy. Economic coercion often targets your exports. So there really needs to be a focus and a conversation about export diversification as well. Import diversification could also be improved. At the moment what we have, it's kind of reliant on FTAs and more should be done there. And then finally, the industrial policy measures we do have, when we decide that the costs of a shock outweigh the costs of an intervention, and therefore we should intervene. What we have at the moment, there's basically EU funding is weak or non-existent. It relies on the IPCAs, which just basically enable member states to provide state aid. And the governance of them is kind of problematic in terms of, monitoring and, almost conditioning on good outcomes. And finally, ex post measures, we think the EU should consider how it best supports firms that are caught in the firing line of economic coercion. Do we need, so we know in the case of Lithuania, they authorized a state aid scheme, which saw very little uptake. It was very regulatorily heavy. So we think there's a conversation there about should the EU basically talking about a support scheme. And the only thing is it needs to be very careful. It doesn't introduce moral hazard by basically telling firms, we will insure you no matter what happens. The very last line is, proportionality and precision do matter. We can't forget the costs of intervening. So I have a list of various costs that are associated with some of the proposed policy solutions regarding economic security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Connor. for this very fantastic overview of those measures taken. I guess we'll transition towards this question of how to achieve the right balance of economic security and sustainability and maintaining an open economy by turning to Georgia, who will be talking about how Huawei is navigating EU economic security policies and efforts of de-risking and how it impacts Huawei.
Thank you very much, Aya. My name is Georgia Picauca. I work for Huawei, specifically for Huawei Digital Power, which is basically the side of the business focusing on renewables, on the technologies that will be contributing to leading on the development and deployment of renewables. I focus on sustainability and industrial policies at EU level. So obviously we have seen quite different dynamics coming from before 2020 to after 2020. So when the European Union Green Deal was launched and all the policy frameworks were developed under the Green Deal, we have seen quite an opportunity to actually contribute to the development of the green transition, so being digital and green transition across Europe. Huawei has been present in the European market since the early 2000s, so we are celebrating now our 24th year in the European market, and Europe is the second biggest market after China. So it's obviously quite important for ourselves, but also for our customers and the consumers who use our technology and continue to choose our technologies despite all the challenges that indeed Chinese suppliers are currently facing. As I was saying, after the EU Green Deal was launched in 2023, we saw like quite a development of the Green Deal into what it is right now, like an industrial Green Deal. So obviously, I mean, this is like taking a different approach on how to looking into the supply chain, as Connor mentioned, you know, like into the diversification of supply chains. And obviously this like has quite an impact on companies like ourselves. Huawei is also like one of the biggest Chinese companies that is leading globally. So like not only in China, you won't see too many Chinese companies currently in Brussels also working on such policies. But this is also like a number increasing because obviously, I mean, China is leading on the green supply chains quite at large. We have seen how the European Union is looking into revamping its industrial capabilities. So to become sort of like competitive, especially like in certain industrial supply chains, and not only on a global scale, but especially at home. This is not something that can be criticized. I mean, it's something that makes perfect sense, especially from an economic and development perspective. But I think Europe also has to ask itself some quite fundamental questions. What are the priorities? Why is the European Union currently working towards a de-risking strategy against China? And second, again, what is the priority? This is especially true for the green transition and also for the deployment of renewables. If the priority is climate neutrality by 2050, then you have to make certain considerations in what kind of partnerships you look at, both in terms of, you know, like G2G, but also in terms of what are the current suppliers that operate in the European Union across all the markets to make sure that like certain technologies are deployed and developed, because it is not to be forgotten. Also, like as we saw from the Renewable Energy Directive, I mean, the European Union wants to achieve 42.5% of renewables, of deployment of renewables in Europe by 2030, and this requires a certain technological know-how, which is not yet in the European market. So also this should bring certain consideration. I personally find it quite hard to believe that Europe can achieve all these ambitious targets, including an industrial strategy that would de-risk almost completely from China, because let's not forget that the political narrative currently is going towards that direction, and also that creates some sort of disruptions within the supply chain, also in terms of relationships that European customers and the commercial partners may have with Chinese suppliers, as well as what if Chinese suppliers want to invest in the European Union to have their own production in Europe. With this kind of political narrative and landscape, obviously this is not to be considered quite a friendly business environment. So these are some considerations to be made. When it comes to Huawei specifically, the implications of all the current industrial strategies, specifically, for example, the Net Zero Industry Act, which has quite a huge impact on the way we operate within Europe and the way we will have to operate by 2026. There are like numerous implications on that front. Huawei is a global leading company, so it can survive, but the narrative around is what is actually making the business more difficult. So we have to review basically our business strategy almost entirely when it comes to the European market, and this has to be done from multiple layers. As I said before, in terms of supply chain disruptions, I mean, this is something that we can already witness, and this will be driven even further if with already highly disrupted supply chains. So when we talk about proportionality, for example, it's not something that we see so much embedded within the current political provisions and proposals, because what you say politically obviously has an impact on the kind of relationship that you have with commercial partners, and like also the level of trustworthiness obviously also gets impacted. So you talk on a political level, and then you talk obviously on a technical level. You can also hamper, like with this kind of discussion and narrative, what is the delivery capacity of or capabilities of the required technologies to deliver the green transition? Because if the supply chains get disrupted, obviously, I mean, then companies also have to rethink how much they can already deploy in their warehouses in Europe, and how much they should, instead like retain outside of the European market. The current geopolitical configuration is already quite negative on that front, and like also China has found itself, and Huawei especially, in the midst of a US-China trade conflict, which did not see at the beginning the EU, but also now the EU is being driven into this trade conflict, and this is also something to be questioned. To be honest, to what extent this can be driven even further. As I mentioned, Huawei has been in Europe for 20 years. We have 13,000 direct jobs created by the company, and 150,000 indirect jobs created by all our business partners. These are considerations to be made, but these are also numbers that we need to know. Because if you push Chinese suppliers outside of the European market, all these jobs will be lost. Jobs that the European Union currently needs and actually has to create even more. So if you want to make the supply chain work, especially on the green transition, make sure to invite foreign investors to invest into local production in Europe. Make sure they feel welcome so that they can continue creating this kind of jobs. A lot of distributors, European distributors that actually deploy renewables, rely entirely on Chinese suppliers. These are like entire businesses that were created thanks to Chinese suppliers, and this is also something to be taken into consideration. We have 2 R&D centers here in Europe, one in Stockholm, one in Nuremberg. The one in Stockholm works specifically on algorithms for our digital power technologies, while the one in Nuremberg on power electronics. This is all know-how and research that is European and stays in Europe. We are the top applicant for patents within the European Patent Office. So this is also something to be taken into consideration. Chinese businesses are not only here to take, but are here to contribute. And I think this is like a narrative that has been taken away from the current geopolitical dimensions, and exactly because everything is being geopoliticized and not necessarily for rational thinking. One thing that I would also like to highlight on this very point, I mean, avoiding talking also with Chinese suppliers, which is a bit of a direction that also the lawmakers, especially in Brussels, are taking, will not make the Chinese suppliers go away. We are here, we have been here for a long time, and we are contributing to the supply chain and to reach the targets of the Net Zero Industry Act and the Green Deal at large. So this is something that to keep in mind, and to understand how to further those relationships and how to work together about what customers and consumers need from the existing Chinese companies. Huawei, in terms of the renewable side of the business, I think it's perhaps important to mention, because in the solar space specifically, we are a manufacturer of string inverters. So we do not produce solar modules, but string inverters, I mean, have quite an essential role to play because obviously they transform energy into electricity, and the demand, is increasing at a very speedy capacity. There are a lot of European manufacturers, so there can be an integration also between European and Chinese manufacturers and suppliers in a way to compete. So instead of only compete, but also collaborate in this technological space. We also supply battery energy storage systems, which are now increasingly in demand and can also help, like with grid congestions, which obviously is like quite a key challenge in Europe. We also work in EV charging infrastructure and as what we call power sites energy efficiency solutions. So to help vertical industries increase their energy efficiency. These are all the key technological components that you would need to actually achieve the targets of the Green Deal, which, by the way, will cost around 1,000 billion euros to achieve. So this is like a very important component to talk. And as I said before, how can a de-risking strategy answer to those 150,000 jobs that we have created in Europe? And we are just one company. There are many more Chinese companies who are contributing to this and who have been entering the European market recently, specifically on the green transition. So these are contributions that we need to take into account and be careful when we take a political stance against that.
Thank you, Georgia, for this very, very interesting input and often not listened to input in this discussion, I believe. I guess it boils down to trust in this discussion. And that's why I would like to ask Angeline to step in to talk about climate diplomacy with China.
Thank you very much, Aya. I think we've heard a lot about the context already, and I think my presentation actually links quite well with what Georgia said. So I'm a policy advisor for E3G, and I work on EU-China climate diplomacy. And recently, climate diplomacy tends to mean a lot more things about de-risking. And we've heard already, and I think as the European Union enters a new political cycle as well, de-risking will be and is as well at the center of the political debate increasingly. And with an expected rapid shift as well in the EU after the European Parliament elections, we are also very much likely to hear more narratives around competitiveness, strategic autonomy, and economic security. So the challenge, I think, for the EU now will be to uphold economic openness and rules-based principles and avoid securitization and a turn to protectionism. So I'm going to focus on green tech. And I think it's quite important to also keep in mind what are the risks that we mentioned, that we hear a lot about, and what does those risks mean for the EU green transition. So you've said it, like to deliver on the EU's promise to make Europe the first climate neutral continent in the world. Green technologies will be a cornerstone of the strategy. But China's near dominance in the global market for clean energy components and the processing of certain critical minerals essential for these clean technologies poses acute risks for Europe's economic competitiveness, national security, energy security, and of course, climate goals. So to give you a bit of an example and a sense of scale as well of the risks this represents for the EU, I will focus on three main key sectors, so solar, batteries, and electric vehicles. So in the solar photovoltaic industry, with Europe's ambitious target of 600 gigawatts of solar energy by 2030, and China's unrivaled positions now in terms of speed, scale, and affordability in the solar supply chain, the EU risks becoming almost entirely dependent on China for its solar expansion. To date, now over 90% of the solar panels deployed in the EU are imported from China. Batteries are also another extremely important industry for Europe's commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, both to decarbonize its road transport and to provide grid storage for the electrification of the economy. And Chinese manufacturers hold a significant grip on the entire battery supply chain, controlling a large proportion of key minerals such as cobalt, lithium, and graphite globally. And they also have a strong presence in minerals processing and the production of key battery components such as cathodes and anodes. And as renewables become an increasingly important part of the EU's energy mix, such heavy reliance on China is not only a competitiveness issue, as we heard, but also it's a risk to its energy and national security. For example, a disruption in the supply chain caused by geopolitical instability, economic pressure, like we noticed with Lithuania or Australia, or any other natural hazards, could seriously hamper the EU's ability to keep pace with the growing demand for renewable electricity and the deployment of the installations. So finally, there is the last sector, the electric vehicle industry, which has emerged as the latest and most contentious green economic battleground, with Chinese manufacturers beginning to enter the European market in full force. To meet its transport decarbonization targets, the EU will need to increase the availability of affordable electric vehicles in the coming years. So we need China. However, Chinese EV manufacturers are also posing a competitive threat, especially to the European car sector, which provides direct and indirect employment for some 13 million Europeans. So domestically, the challenge for the EU is to know what the trade-offs are and to know what type and level of risk the EU is willing to accept. And I think, as Executive Vice President Margaret Vestager said last month, as we further develop the strategy for clean technologies, we must also reflect on the question of trustworthiness. And then on the international stage, there is an interesting dimension as well, because China is also making climate and clean energy the centerpiece of its battle of narrative on global governance. Beijing has played the developed versus developing country divide, especially after the COP28 in Dubai last year, and is using also the trade issue to accuse developed countries of practicing green protectionism. But Beijing's status as a developing country is also becoming increasingly unrealistic, and it is also challenging its position as the leader of the global south. For example, we know that China will soon overtake the EU historical CO2 emissions around the middle of this decade, and that some Chinese official think tank now also actually acknowledges the need to contribute more to climate finance to developing countries. But it's also worth noting that China's delivery track record is quite underwhelming. China's climate finance to the global south is falling short of its own pledges, with only 10% of its promised South-South climate finance to have been delivered. So I think there is here as well a room for the EU to challenge China's narrative in the global south as well. So just a few recommendations. So I think how to address dependencies, supply chain vulnerabilities, and economic and political risks will require a delicate balancing act by the EU to avoid both the risk of doing too little and the danger of doing too much. And there's also tipping into protectionism and risking being counterproductive. De-risking should be understood as a process of risk mitigation and management rather than the elimination of all risks. And as Europe's prosperity is deeply rooted in global economic integration, it is also crucial for Europe to avoid or resist pursuing protectionist or nationalistic economic policies. Europe's strength therefore lies in diversifying its economic relations, building its capacities and its role as a geopolitical actor. We also need a unified long-term vision for EU-China relations. While we have this triptych that remains quite a good basis for discussion, I think the partnership angle has been increasingly lost in translation. And in the absence of a well-defined, enduring strategy, EU actions and policies towards China, whether targeted or not, will have been predominantly reactive and defensive. And given the lack of common understanding and unity among the European nations, the EU is in danger of developing an increasingly wide range of instruments that are ineffective or ill-suited to the risks at hand. So I think now that we are entering a new European political cycle with a new mandate for both the European Parliament and also the European Commission this year, it's also a perfect opportunity for the EU to adopt a coherent, comprehensive and consistent long-term China strategy that can successfully guide its steps in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Angeline, for this very critical input. I would like to welcome Frank Hofmeister to this discussion. We're very lucky that he was able to make it. I was going to initially ask him to provide the first input, and I think since we've transitioned to this course, I would prefer giving you the final word and give Greg the microphone.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to basically relate to some of the points that have already been made and to maybe put us in the wider context of where EU-China relations sit right now, because indeed I agree with my the previous speakers that we are in a problematic position where there are a lot of tensions, and it's a question of how do we resolve them, given the fact that the key issue here is again the question of trust and actions taken also on both sides. So they're looking at the question of sustainability that is driving our discussion. I also want to put forward the question about the sustainability of EU-China relations in its current model, which is going to be a very, very big issue, given the fact that already we had the last EU-China summit in December, where the European side basically labeled it as the summit of choices, whereby specific considerations were put towards the Chinese side, whether we're talking here about the geopolitical considerations related to China's position vis-a-vis Russia, but also the economic considerations. And we've seen the new instruments that have been locked into place and being rolled out and used in that context, whether that's foreign subsidies regulation, whether those are the investigations into the EVs. All of that is happening in the end of the day in the big political context, which already has also been mentioned. And I think we have to take a step back and take a look at where we are right now in terms of this specific moment in which we're having this discussion, because indeed, we are right after a very intense outreach from the Chinese side towards the EU level. We had a flurry of high-level dialogues throughout the autumn last year. And we also are now in the process of the outreach towards European capitals. We had the trip to Beijing by Prime Minister Rutte, by Chancellor Scholz. President Xi Jinping was in France, Serbia, and Hungary. We have Prime Minister Meloni going to China. We also were supposed to have Prime Minister Fico going to China. We'll have President Duda from Poland going to China. There is definitely the moment of outreach. In terms of progress on issues of key concern, not really much. And there is a big problem, and that links to the question of sustainability of trade and the topic of our capacity that you asked me to relate to in the remarks. And here we are on a trajectory set for more tensions. It's really about the fact of how is the EU supposed to react in a situation where the issue is going to get worse rather than better, and there is no meaningful dialogue right now with the Chinese side as to how to resolve it. If we take a look at the fact that China is responsible or is home to more than 30% of global manufacturing, at the same time around 20% of global GDP, simply the consumption on the Chinese side is unable to basically absorb the production on the Chinese side. We've also seen under the administration of President Xi Jinping basically increase acceptance of loss in specific strategic industries, which is related to geopolitical concerns, the whole question of how unsafe China feels in the context of technology, but generally speaking, this direction for securitization on the Chinese side also relates to trying to be the leader in those specific technologies. And we also don't see prospects for that changing, given the fact that China is now talking about the new productive forces being the leading direction for the economy. So more investment in solar panels and batteries, in legacy semiconductors, in EVs. So in other words, not only already China is producing more than it's able to consume and is supported by the subsidies, it's investing more into the capabilities to produce even more. At the same time as Europe, we are in a situation in which the US is reacting with very high tariffs. Recently, 100% tariffs on the EVs, 50% tariffs on semiconductors. coming from China. So it's going to go somewhere. It's likely going to go to Europe. So we are really in a situation of inability to address the issue in discussion with China, as we've seen President Xi Jinping coming to Europe and saying specifically and explicitly also in the Chinese readouts, in the exchange with President Macron and President von der Leyen, that there is no such issue as Chinese overcapacity. So there is right now no dialogue on those issues of key concern, given the fact that China basically flat out denies that the issue exists. This was not the case in the previous overcapacity cycles when we're talking about steel, when we're talking about solar panels. There, at least, the channels of communications were open and we could try to navigate the issue. Right now, it's also about the technologies that are higher in the value chain. So they're having more impact on the European jobs, and also, again, the questions of green transition and the question of our future economic competitiveness. So this is where we are in this very problematic situation where there is no dialogue on those issues of key concern. I would argue that China or Beijing seems to be under impression that with the elections in the EU and especially elections with the US, should they go in a specific direction, somehow the issue will be just resolved, where the EU is basically bluffing and it's possible to have the member state capitals basically have the European side scale back on the policies, which I think is very important that we send a clear message from the European side also after the elections, that the direction of our thinking about the risking is there. The issues are there. They're not going to change regardless of who sits in the European Parliament or who sits in the White House. The ways that we're going to respond definitely are going to be to a certain extent affected, but the issues are there and we need to recognize them. And that points to me to maybe one more point related to timing. Given the fact that we have the rollout of those instruments, we haven't had the reaction on the Chinese side yet to, for example, foreign subsidy regulations. It has been relatively muted. With the reaction to the investigation into electric vehicles and potential tariffs, this is where a reaction is going to happen. So we're literally now 2-3 weeks away from the moment when we're going to see how actually China reacts in that context. So in other words, we're now in a moment where more tensions are ahead of us. And this is something that we should acknowledge. And this comes down and boils down to a more fundamental question to my mind right now on the European, from the European side, which is the fact that increasingly economic relationship with China is, to my mind, becoming an issue of systemic rivalry, given the fact that it's literally about the impact of China's jump on the new productive forces and doubling down on the impact of Chinese subsidies is becoming more pronounced for the European market. So in other words, how do we find it compatible in terms of our focus on competition-driven economy with China's really subsidy and not really demand, but rather supply-driven economy, and how this is going to play out also in the context of third markets. And maybe before closing this very gloomy remark, and happy to also be debated on those points during our conversation, maybe one point on resilience and the question of the risking. Because the way that we've been discussing the risking has for a long time been framed by the discussion about economic security. The risking has been an economic discussion, even though in the initial announcement, President von der Leyen also talked about the diplomatic de-risking being part of it, etc. But then the discussion after the council conclusions in June last year focused on the economic aspects of the risking. I think it's very important when talking and thinking about the EU's relationship with China and our response is that we take a broader approach towards the risking, thinking also on the EU level, even though here the competences are of course an issue, but thinking about the topics related to the risking within society, whether that's foreign information manipulation and interference, or whether it's talking simply about the fact that we don't really have enough foreign correspondents in China, which is also could be a de-risking measure. The fact that we are actually informed as to the situation on the ground through different sources. So it's just a point to make that while I know that today we're talking about trade and geopolitics, I also want to make a point that we should be thinking more broadly in terms of those responses related to risking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, for this fantastic input. I think you created a perfect platform for Hofmeister to come in to talk about the external European External Action Service perspective. Is it an impossible triangle to tackle security, economic, and climate risks? And how do you navigate the tensions ahead of us?
Yeah, thank you very much, Aya, for inviting me for this very interesting panel, and also giving me the floor to explain a little bit from the practical point of view of the EU institutions. I speak here in my personal capacity. Maybe first, it would be good if we agree on the analysis. So where are the issues? And if I heard now all the interveners, I think there is common ground. First issue, also coming from Huawei's perspective, trust me, and don't become protectionists. That was your credo. From our perspective, trust needs transparency. And that starts, for example, with the question, who's the owner of Huawei? What is your structures? How many subsidies do you get? And so on. And on this one, there is not sufficient information there, and therefore it's difficult to develop trust. So that's number one. So transparency versus trust. Second issue, I think both of you mentioned, Angelina and Greg, capacity of China to produce green goods as such is, of course, wonderful. We are happy to have green goods to save the climate. But if there is 30% production and 20% consumption at home, there could be an issue of oversupply. And I think this is an analysis which is shared by many in Europe and the US, but the Chinese leadership does not share that. So as recent as in the OECD summit and in May, there was a big clash, an open diplomatic clash, where many OECD countries said, this is an issue for us. And the Chinese delegation simply said, it's not an issue at all. So if this is the response, you will have difficulties in solving it by political means. Because if there's no common analysis of the problem, well, then you are a little bit pushed into a situation, also for the EU, that we have to react unilaterally. So if there is no acknowledgement of the problem by the other side, what else can you do? And that leads to a couple of instruments. And here, maybe I give you just a few, are not exhaustive. The traditional instrument on tackling trade problems with overcapacity and oversupply is anti-dumping, anti-subsidy cases, which are handled by the European Commission. And we had the very important experience with the solar panels, where the EU did impose a couple of measures, both on subsidies and on dumping, on the basis, and that's very important, that the prices of the European industry cannot match the imports. Okay, that's competitive issues. But if the imports are so low in prices because they are heavily subsidized, we are entering from normal trade into a situation of unfair trade. So if one side gets millions of subsidies and the other side doesn't, then it's clear that the price competition doesn't really work. So there we have an issue where it is a perfectly accepted tool in international trade. In this kind of situation, you can put anti-dumping or anti-subsidy levies to rebalance the situation, and that's what Europe did on solar panels. But it didn't have the relevant effect because it came probably too late, and the European industry was already in a very, very shaky situation. Even with the protection offered by the Commission, it could not really survive. That's why we have now the 90% figure that you've said. That's the number one. So if you want to use this instrument, you better do it early and not too late. Yeah. Second, what was the Chinese reaction at the time? And I can tell you because I had been deputy head of cabinet of Commissioner de Gucht to live through the entire solar panels situation. And the Chinese reaction was, okay, we are going to sanction you and your EU exports to China with anti-dumping measures on wine. Yeah, totally unrelated. And there was absolutely no dumping on wine. So it was political retaliation, which had no foundation in the WTO. Illegal retaliation, very clearly so. And the Chinese government used illegal retaliation to put pressure on the EU to stop the solar panel case. That was reaction number one. And reaction number two, related to solar panels, there was a retaliation against those who do the, let's say, step one in the production, namely those, including European companies who would import into China, were also subject to a case. And that was used as another bargain. Yeah, a German company, Wacker, was suffering and lost half of its market share in China. Yeah, as a, let's say, countermeasure. That these kind of countermeasures against anti-subsidy and anti-dumping measures are not allowed in the WTO. So this is a very difficult part of the Chinese policy, and we can expect something of the like. Yeah, and I underline again, most likely illegal reaction, yeah, which will be for the European Union another challenge. Second, a new control on investments. I think you mentioned the foreign subsidy regulation. Why do we have this? Not because Europe becomes protectionist, because we want to have more transparency, to know who invests in the EU market with the kind of money at home. And that would, for example, look at the ownership structures. We will see how effective this is. We are in the beginning, but it is not meant to be a protectionist tool. It is addressing this problem I have just mentioned. Third one is, of course, political dialogue. We want to be cooperative and also remind China of its responsibility. So if you become grown up, if you have, rightly so, a certain pride of being a global player in trade and investment, you also should shoulder responsibilities. And that means, number one, you're not a developing country. In the WTO, self-designation was when China acceded to the WTO in 2001. Okay, maybe at the time self-designation was correct, but now we are in 2024. If you look at all the statistics, and to say China is among the poor of the world, this is simply not credible anymore. And the Chinese government also uses that to say, because we have been a developing country in the WTO, we are also a developing country for the Paris Agreement on climate. And that means we have much less responsibility, and then we only pay 10% of what we promise. Sorry, that's not very, very responsible behavior. It's not. And therefore, we are here in a situation where even in the situation of calling and respecting China to play its part on an equal level, there is something to be desired. And this makes unfortunate situation that indeed, rightly so, I think the tendency is at the moment not easy. It doesn't mean that Europe is going to become, how to say, very categorical like the United States. We still try to address these issues, but I have to tell you that the answers for the time being are less than satisfactory.
Thank you very much. I guess I would welcome from the audience virtually and around here to submit their question if there are any. And in the meantime, I'd welcome you to react to each other's input. And perhaps, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, then I will maybe start with what Frank was just mentioning. Obviously, I mean, I represent a Chinese company, but not the Chinese government, so I will not comment on that. But in terms of the governance or the structure of the governance of the company, this is actually something we have been communicating for, I mean, quite extensively, especially here in Europe, because there is an assumption that Huawei is a participative company by the government, also because probably it's not a publicly listed company, but the governance of the company is actually reliant on full shares owned by its employees. This is also publicly available information. There is when we talk about trustworthiness, and I think this is a problem because no matter what we say, it's not being trusted. It's not being believed. So this is like I think quite a point to mention. When it comes to the industrial competitiveness also in Europe, we've been quite supportive of this. And when the Net Zero Industry Act was published, for example, we have been, like welcoming the policy proposal and understood that obviously the European Union wants to rebuild its industrial capabilities, but we want to be part of it. That was the main message. Bringing knowledge, innovation, capabilities to the table. Obviously, working with an international player like Huawei can actually help the strategy that the European Union has put in place. So I would also like to focus more on the industrial side of the strategy that the EU has been working on, and also how sustainability became a factor of this industrial strategy, and how sustainability has been used also against the participation of some Chinese companies. I've been seeing this obviously because now there is ongoing negotiations on the secondary legislations of the Net Zero Industry Act, and European manufacturers implying that they bring a better quality and products that are better compliant with sustainability policies. But we have been actually not only complying, but even though it was not required by law, reporting on our sustainability efforts since 2008. And when it comes to our products specifically, and I've mentioned earlier in the solar value chain, we are a manufacturer of solar inverters. We have been verified even on the carbon footprint of our products, and we were the first company to do so, beyond what is even required by EU legislation. So I also think we need to balance a bit more the allegation against Chinese companies and to be a bit more practical and work on a framework that is workable, but also verifiable. And right now, the narrative is slightly too politicized, and we are not talking anymore at the technical level, what I was also mentioning before. But company to company, and also when the policy proposals come forward, they have to take into account the technical level discussion. And this is where we are very eager to play along and demonstrate that we are trustworthy. So this is, I mean, at least my 2 cents for the country.
Thank you very much. I guess maybe we can take a step back from trust. Regardless of trust, there is a severe dependence on certain areas in green tech supply chain. So regardless of trust, these dependencies pose a risk, and they might need to be addressed in some sort of way. And if we trust Chinese companies, or if we don't trust Chinese, or we trust Chinese companies to some degree, will, I guess, can determine the level of measures that we should be considering in the EU. So I would like to ask the group, the round participants, what they think is the adequate balance in terms of measures, instead of maybe getting stuck on the trust question. Maybe I'll start with Angeline.
No, yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's important to also like step back from the trust question. But I think, as Frank mentioned earlier, trust is also a very important issue, and especially regarding transparency.
Yeah.
So I think this is where we need trust to also be able to measure correctly what are the appropriate instruments to use. And when you don't have a transparent eyesight on the flows, for example, it's very difficult to have appropriate measures as well. So no, I just wanted to jump back on what Connor said earlier. I think that appropriate measures anyway need to be proportionate and have to be targeted as well. It's quite important not to, as I was saying in my speech earlier, not to tip into protectionism. I think that's the fear at the moment. So that's quite important to keep in mind. Maybe one more point as well to react to Georgia's earlier comment as well. I think the EU should not have to choose between protecting its industries and reaching its climate goals, because we need to maintain the competitiveness of the EU to reach those climate goals. So in terms of to also answer your question, I think as long as we have been doing the EU has been doing for now, it's to be compliant with the WTO rules. I think China should also take that and take the responsibility into account as well.
If I can maybe jump on the topic, and also sorry for bringing back trust a little bit into the discussion, but just to make the point that this is the key reason why we're discussing this, because we're not talking about dependence on partners that are considered trustworthy. In that context, of course, diversification is an issue, but it's not fundamental. And partially the reason why this has become such an intense topic, it's not only because sudden change of mind on the European side in the context of China, but there are specific lessons that have been drawn, whether we're talking about pandemic and dependence on supply of PPEs, whether we're talking about Russian invasion and reliance on energy. So it's not really just a China-targeted measure. It's a wider discussion of the EU's rethinking about its resilience in the broader terms. So I don't think that framing the discussion as only focused on the risk of being anti-China is the right framing. And it's not the framing in which I think the discussion is also unfolding on the European side when it comes to economic security and more broadly the question of resilience. Second of all, I think that when we're talking about proportional response, part of the problem that we have here is that response is not only through protective measures. And this is a much wider discussion that we're having right now about the EU, because it's not only about putting on tariffs and calling it a day, it's a question about also our industrial policy. And again, discussion between different European member states as to how to navigate in terms of, for example, the CHIPS Act, where the money is going to go, who's going to really benefit through that. So I just think that this is part of an issue where we should be mindful that this discussion in the end of the day, as much, again, might be weird coming from a person that is very, very China focused, but I don't think that this discussion is solely about China and trust towards China. It's a much broader thing that we're looking at here.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what's been said, and on the point of the appropriate instruments, I think it's important to be realistic. We talked about solar panels earlier, and yes, there's enormous dependency there, but you know, to an extent, the horse is bolted there. We are dependent on China, and if we're looking at this from a climate point of view, we can get solar panels there for a lot cheaper than we can get them from domestic manufacturers. So we need to be kind of careful. Again, I think sometimes there's a tendency to fight the last war. You know, a shock to solar panel imports from China is not the same as a shock to energy imports from Russia. Yes, it will slow down our deployment. Yes, it will slow down our ability to decarbonize, which is clearly massively important. But there's a real trade-off. You know, if we try to move away now, do we slow down our transition now by making the transition more expensive? So I think there's just while we do obviously want to learn the lessons from recent instances, we can't overlearn them to an extent. Second, this idea of being realistic, I think also tracks into some of the legislative kind of packages we've seen. So the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, you know, do we need domestic manufacturing targets in some of those areas? You know, conversations we've had is that, you know, we should be focusing on things like recycling a lot more than, you know, necessarily hugely increasing our mining capacities within Europe. And I know it's not an either or, but there is just an idea of an acknowledgement of, you know, we can't, to an extent, you know, we've seen those lists of critical technologies now. I went through earlier. We're there, yeah. It's maybe important to learn the lessons of past instances of acting early, preventing technological leakage, maintaining advancement now. But in terms of where the situation is now, be that around raw materials, be that around green industry, it's, you know, there needs to be a frank and honest and realistic conversation of what Europe can and should do. Now, on solar panels, for example, some of my colleagues had a piece and they really emphasized we should be looking at recycling, we should be looking at innovation. That's where the EU should be adding its value. That's where our comparative advantage is. So yeah, it's basically possibly having to have some tough conversations with some industry people and holding the line.
Thank you. We have a question from
Emily Kirstens. I lead our EU green trade work at E3G. I'm a colleague of Angeline's, and by no means a China expert, so I'll defer to her on any of that. But I wanted to add a few provocations for all of you. You know, I started the discussion saying China is the elephant in the room, but it's not just the elephant in the room for the EU and the US. It's also the elephant in the room for developing countries. So I've heard a lot about what the EU's strategy towards China should be, but in its China approach, it also has to think about its relationship and its trust with third countries, because in its actions towards China, it is affecting its relationships with those third countries. That then in turn links me to the issue of competitiveness. I think we talk a lot about competitiveness in the EU, but it's also important for the EU to be competitive as the EU at the global stage. So how do you manage that, the relationship of the EU vis-a-vis China in the world, and the need for relationships and partnerships with third countries? And then a final provocation there is, talked a little bit about the EU framework, but what is the international framework going to be? You know, the subsidies rules are not up to par. I think that can be agreed by most countries. The EU tried to launch a work stream on industrial policy at the ministerial conference, and it was unsuccessful. So what's next is going to continue within the WTO. Are there other fora, maybe the G20, the G7? I'd be interested to hear more on all of this.
anyone wants to address any of these questions?
Happy to start. So when it comes to let's say the nexus of the EU's relationship with China and with the countries in the global south, which is as always has to my mind be mentioned, is a horrible term, but we don't have a better one as of now in the ongoing discussions. Yes, indeed, this is an issue, and this is also the question of how do we respond as the EU when we look at, for example, the framing of the Global Gateway initiative, in a way that it shouldn't be framed as a response related to China's activity. Simply, it's about our interest in developing relations with partners in from the developing countries as such, which I think is very important in this regard. Part of the problem, to my mind, related to exactly the question of sustainability, also our competitiveness, is that while as the EU, we might be introducing the foreign subsidy regulations in order to protect our market, we have to remember that our companies are going to compete in those third countries, also in the developing countries, which are very often much more focused on also the cost of specific technologies with heavily subsidized Chinese competitors. And this is very often the case of the problem that we have. And this is why I mentioned before the question of in the end of the day, economic systemic rivalry emerging, because we have to keep in mind that, for example, when we are looking at a European shipping company competing with COSCO, it's not really competing just with COSCO, with the Chinese giant, the shipping giant. It's really competing with the entire supply chain that COSCO has access to, for example, even cheaper raw materials, simply through the way that the Chinese economy is structured. So this is where we have a very big issue of, and that is the next step for our discussion about the competition with China in third markets. Where also as the EU, I don't think right now we have the right framework in order to put forward the right tools to tackle this issue. I think this is a big problem. And this is where also the coordination with the other partners comes in. And I think that right now, what we're looking at is, of course, the coordination, the sometimes problematic transatlantic coordination on China, where we're looking at the high-level EU-US dialogue on China, where we're looking at Trade and Technology Council, both of which have not really delivered to the extent that maybe was hoped for during the Biden administration. There are also more exchanges within the G7 where also EU plays the role. But in terms of meaningful coordination on China, it has not been the easiest. Partially, to my mind, that relates to also simply the topic that has already been put forward, which is the question of the EU's own strategy and policy vis-a-vis China. Because very often we talk about the idea of the united EU policy on China, which I don't think is really the realistic framing right now, because in order for us to have a united China policy, we would have to have united European foreign policy, period. And this is the issue. We might have more coordination, but full unity on that, I think, will be really problematic. So in that sense, I would even take a step back as we're entering the new mandate. To my mind, a point that we should be now looking at is take a look at the 2019 strategic outlook. Don't touch the triptych, don't touch the three-pronged approach. It's not worth changing it. It's not blocking us with anything. Take a look at the 10 action points that have been attached to the strategic outlook. They have already been delivered or not delivered by now. This could be updated. So create the boundaries or let's say the groundwork for coordination. And this is then something that we can bring forward our discussion with the partners abroad as well.
Maybe I'll use my privilege as a chair to force Hofmeister to address the question with regards to competing with China and China's climate diplomacy and the global south, and what the External Action Service is doing in terms of competing.
Well, I would like to say that climate policy is a global policy. So starting point is very much what Greg said. There are maybe many problems that are triggered by the dimension of the Chinese, but it doesn't mean that they are the only element of our policy. So first thing to mention is we have an active climate policy with a lot of outreach. The EIS has a climate envoy. At the same time, the European Commission is implementing internally the Paris Agreement, and we of course pay a lot of money in projects. So all this is part of one package to not only address big polluters to become more responsible, but also to reach out others in the world. And that is what is currently happening. So we have a lot of, preparatory talks always for every next COP to set the targets, what is the realistic achievements, to get more support behind what was seen traditionally as the Western agenda. So the Westerners, Europe wants to see more ambitions and so on. Okay, let them do that and we pocket some money, basically. Yeah, and this thinking, yeah, needs to be changed. That is really a common concern for all. And that, okay, maybe Europe may be more ambitious, but at the end of the day, it's also in their self-interest to become more ambitious. And this is needs explanations and needs support on the ground and to find technical solutions and so on and so on. That's also why we combine it with the support of green technology, green trade, and all this. And this is precisely in order to tackle also a bit the viewpoint of the countries who may perceive to be on the receiving end between rivalries. That's not what we want to say. We want to tell them, look, we are engaging in a way to bring forward the implementation of jointly agreed rules. You may, in your national action plans, become also more ambitious for your own good, and we, Europe, are reaching out your hands. And this, I think, third countries would acknowledge is a partnership approach, and then they may compare it with the approach of others. But I also want to address, without being forced, the issue of international framework for subsidies. Yeah, you rightly mentioned that WTO is not going forward with this. It's not a surprise for us. WTO works on the basis of consensus, and if China says it's not a problem, the WTO will not address this. Yeah, could it be to then better suited to go to G20? Likely the outcome will be the same, but it could put more peer pressure on Beijing. Yeah, so if other big G20 countries say, look, we need to do something, this may have more impact than simply when it comes from a point from us. And that's why it was interesting to see in the OECD summit in May that most of the people said there was an issue here, and China was a bit isolated in pushing back. And that's important, and that's why also G7 could be a suitable framework, but then real decisions in order to be binding on China cannot be made. It can only be political agreements. And in this kind of situation, we need to go forward with what we have. And one interesting example, which probably was not mentioned yet, is how to fight cross-border subsidies. So here, the EU made also a step forward. We have a famous case where Chinese companies with subsidies from Beijing government are active in a special economic zone in Egypt. The Egyptian government says, welcome. We put out a special development zone for you where you get all kinds of privileges to run your shop, basically. And then they produce in Egypt and send the product to Europe. And this in case it was a glass fiber fabrics, chemical stuff, GFF case. And then the European Union had to say, okay, what do we do with this? Yeah, so Chinese subsidies, but production takes place in Egypt. And at the end of the day, the dump products land on the European market. And if you look at the WTO rules, they don't address that directly. They simply say a subsidy given by a government, which may lead to distortion, can be countervailed. But this kind of cross-border situation was not seen as a problem at the time when it was written. And there the European Commission took a step forward, a courageous one, and said, oh, yeah, we think in this particular situation, the fact that the Egyptian government has, at the highest level, president level, invited the Chinese investments and given them all kinds of privileges on their territory means that the Egyptian government actually has acknowledged and made these subsidies part of their own policy. Therefore, the Egyptian goods, when they are sent to Europe, can also be countervailed. Yeah. So this is a reaction to, I wouldn't say a shortcoming, but at least a lack of clarity in the WTO framework, where then the European Commission goes forward and says, okay, this is our analysis, and the European Court has confirmed its legality, and China didn't attack it in the WTO. Interesting. So that's a little bit my request, or let's say for researchers to look at this. If you cannot change the framework because China rejects it, at least you can try to, how to say, evolve with a dynamic interpretation under the current rules to deal with these kind of situations.
A very small follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
My understanding was that it was not necessarily China who blocked the workstream on industrial policy, but of course I was not in the room. I was in Abu Dhabi, but on the sidelines. So would you say it was China who blocked?
No, I wouldn't say it does block the industrial stream, but what I would say that China is clearly against putting new disciplines on subsidies. And that we know. I mean, we have put it in our WTO reform package, so this is an important part. And if, as long as there is denial that there's a big problem, there will also be no willingness to agree on new rules, which would make it harder for Beijing to put out subsidies. It's pretty clear.
But China is also developing very skillfully new ways to support certain goals that are not necessarily always visible. But yes, we are coming to an end of the discussion. We talked about China, we talked about sustainability, we talked about excessive dependence, and a lot of challenges that we have to tackle. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for joining me in this discussion. And I'd like to mention the remaining session of this forum, being trade and migration, trade and agriculture, and trade and development in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for joining us today.